In the summer of 1944, Paris had been under Nazi occupation for more than 4 years. The City of Light had become a city of darkness, its streets patrolled by German soldiers, its people living under the brutal regime of Adolf Hitler's Third Reich. But in August of that year, everything was about to change. This is the story of how Paris was liberated, how the French people rose up against their oppressors, and how Allied forces helped free one of the world's most iconic cities. It's a story of courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable spirit of a nation determined to reclaim its freedom. On June 14, 1940, German forces entered Paris without firing a shot. The French government had declared Paris an open city to spare it from destruction, and Wehrmacht troops marched triumphantly down the Champs-Élysées. For Parisians, it was a moment of profound humiliation and shock. The cafes that once buzzed with intellectual debate fell silent. The museums were looted. The streets were renamed with German signs. For the French people, it marked the beginning of a dark and oppressive chapter in their history that would last over 4 years. Adolf Hitler himself visited Paris on June 23, 1940, touring the city's landmarks in the early morning hours. He posed for photographs in front of the Eiffel Tower, visited Napoleon's tomb, and toured the Opera House. For Hitler, Paris represented the ultimate trophy, a testament to German military superiority and the fulfillment of a long-time obsession with France's capital. The image of Hitler standing before the Eiffel Tower became one of the most iconic and painful symbols of the occupation for the French people. Life under Nazi occupation was harsh and degrading. Food shortages became severe, and Parisians stood in long queues for meagre rations of bread, meat, and vegetables. The black market flourished as desperate people sought to feed their families. Coal and heating fuel were scarce, making winters brutal. The German occupiers requisitioned the finest hotels, restaurants, and theatres for their own use, while ordinary French citizens struggled to survive on diminishing resources. Malnutrition became common, especially among children and the elderly. Jewish residents faced particularly brutal persecution. Beginning in June 1942, French Jews were forced to wear yellow Star of David badges, identifying them as Jewish. This was part of the Nazis' systematic persecution that would culminate in the Holocaust. The yellow star marked Jews for discrimination, harassment, and violence, isolating them from the rest of society and making them targets for arrest and deportation. The most infamous act of persecution was the Vel d'Hiv roundup in July 1942, when over 13,000 Jewish men, women, and children were arrested in coordinated raids across Paris. French police, under pressure from German authorities and the collaborationist Vichy government, carried out these arrests. The victims were held in terrible conditions at the Velodrome de Yver indoor cycling stadium before being deported to concentration camps. Most would never return. This collaboration between French authorities and the Nazi occupiers would haunt France for generations. But not all French citizens submitted to German rule. From the earliest days of the occupation, resistance movements began to form. Small groups of patriots engaged in acts of sabotage, distributed underground newspapers, provided intelligence to the Allies, and helped Allied pilots and escaped prisoners of war evade capture. The French resistance was not a single, unified organization, but rather a collection of networks and groups with different political affiliations: communist groups, Gaullists loyal to General Charles de Gaulle, socialists, and independents. Despite their differences, they shared a common goal: to liberate France from Nazi tyranny. Resistance activities took many forms. Underground newspapers were printed in secret locations and distributed at great risk, keeping hope alive and spreading news that countered German propaganda. Intelligence networks gathered information about German troop movements, fortifications and plans, sending coded messages to London. Saboteurs targeted railway lines, bridges, and communication infrastructure to disrupt German military operations. As the war progressed and Allied invasion seemed more likely, these activities intensified dramatically. On June 6, 1944, the course of the war in Europe changed forever. Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in military history, saw over 150,000 Allied troops land on the beaches of Normandy. American, British, Canadian, and other Allied forces fought their way ashore against fierce German resistance, establishing a crucial foothold in occupied France. The success of D-Day marked the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe. In the weeks that followed, Allied forces broke out of Normandy and began their advance across France, liberating towns and villages that had endured 4 years of occupation. The Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, faced a crucial strategic decision as his forces advanced through France. Should they make a direct assault on Paris, or should they bypass the city and continue the rapid advance toward Germany? From a purely military standpoint, bypassing Paris made sense. The city's liberation would require significant resources, including food and supplies for over 2 million civilians. Urban warfare could be costly in lives and time. Eisenhower's primary objective was to destroy the German army and end the war as quickly as possible, and Paris seemed like a potential distraction from that goal. However, General Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French forces, insisted that Paris must be liberated, and that French forces should play a leading role in that liberation. De Gaulle had spent the war years in exile, building the Free French movement and positioning himself as the legitimate leader of France. He was fiercely nationalistic and understood that whoever liberated Paris would shape France's post-war future. He was determined that French troops would enter the city first, that his provisional government would immediately assume authority, and that France would be seen by the world as one of the victorious Allied powers, not merely as a defeated nation that had been rescued. The French 2nd Armoured Division, commanded by General Philippe Leclerc, had been fighting alongside Allied forces since the North African campaign. The division was composed of Free French soldiers who had refused to accept defeat in 1940 and had continued the fight from abroad. Leclerc and his men were desperate to be the ones who liberated Paris. They had trained for this moment, and the symbolic importance of French soldiers freeing the French capital could not be overstated. Leclerc himself had made a vow after the fall of France that he would not rest until the tricolour flew again over Paris. By mid-August 1944, the situation in Paris had reached a breaking point. News of Allied advances spread through the city, and anticipation of liberation grew. The French resistance within Paris, organised under the banner of the French Forces of the Interior, FFI, began to plan an uprising. On August 19, 1944, the Paris police went on strike and occupied the prefecture of police, raising the French tricolour for the first time in 4 years. This bold act sparked a general uprising throughout the city. It was a moment of tremendous courage, as the police were declaring their allegiance to France rather than to the German occupiers. Barricades began appearing throughout the city, constructed from overturned vehicles, paving stones, sandbags, and furniture. These improvised fortifications were reminiscent of the Paris Commune of 1871 and earlier revolutionary uprisings. The citizens of Paris were declaring that they would not wait passively to be liberated. They would fight for their own freedom. Within hours, hundreds of barricades had been erected across the city's neighbourhoods. The resistance fighters were a diverse group: students, workers, shopkeepers, teachers, veterans of World War I, and even teenagers who had grown up under occupation. They wore civilian clothes with FFI armbands to identify themselves as combatants under the laws of war. Their weapons were a motley collection: hunting rifles, pistols taken from dead German soldiers, captured firearms, homemade bombs and Molotov cocktails. Ammunition was scarce, and fighters often had only a handful of bullets. Many had no military training whatsoever. Yet they were determined to strike back against the occupiers who had oppressed them for so long. Fierce fighting erupted across Paris. Resistance fighters attacked German patrols, occupied public buildings, and engaged in urban guerrilla warfare. The Germans responded with force, using tanks, machine guns, and artillery against the lightly armed insurgents. Casualties mounted on both sides. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. Buildings were damaged by gunfire and explosions. The city that Hitler wanted preserved was now becoming a battleground. The uprising was risky and desperate, but the Resistance fought with the passion of people who had suffered under occupation for 4 long years and were willing to die for their freedom. The German garrison in Paris consisted of approximately 20,000 troops under the command of General Dietrich von Choltitz, who had been appointed military governor of Paris on August 7, 1944. Von Choltitz was a professional soldier with a reputation for following orders without question. When he arrived in Paris, Adolf Hitler gave him explicit instructions. If Paris could not be held, it was to be destroyed. Hitler ordered that the city's bridges, monuments, and important buildings should be mined and blown up rather than allow them to fall into Allied hands intact. Hitler was furious at the thought of losing Paris and wanted to ensure that if he could not have the city, no one would. Von Choltitz faced a dilemma. He was a German officer who had sworn an oath of loyalty to Hitler, but he was also a man who understood that the war was lost. The Swedish consul general in Paris, Raoul Nordling, played a crucial role during these tense days. Nordling acted as an intermediary between von Choltitz and the French resistance, negotiating a brief truce to allow humanitarian considerations and to prevent the wholesale destruction of Paris. Nordling appealed to von Choltitz's conscience, asking whether he wanted to be remembered as the man who destroyed Paris. These conversations may have influenced von Choltitz's ultimate decision. As fighting raged in Paris, General Leclerc and the French 2nd Armoured Division were desperate to reach the city. On August 22nd, Eisenhower finally gave the order for Allied forces to move on Paris, partly due to reports of the uprising, and partly due to de Gaulle's insistence that delay could lead to disaster, either mass civilian casualties or a communist takeover. Leclerc received the order with joy and immediately began planning the advance. His division would lead the way with American forces in support. It was the moment he and his men had been waiting for since 1940. The French 2nd Armoured Division began its advance toward Paris on August 23rd. The route was not easy. German forces were still capable of resistance, and the division encountered roadblocks, minefields, and defensive positions. Fighting broke out at several points along the way. But Leclerc's men were motivated by the knowledge that Paris was waiting, that their countrymen were fighting and dying in the streets, and that every hour of delay could mean more destruction and more casualties. They pushed forward with determination, sometimes bypassing German positions to maintain momentum. American forces, including elements of the 4th Infantry Division, supported the French advance. The Americans provided additional firepower, logistics support, and assistance in overcoming German resistance. The relationship between the French and American forces was generally good, though there were occasional tensions over tactics and command. Eisenhower had made it clear that French forces would have the honour of entering Paris first, but American units would be ready to assist if needed. The combined Allied force represented the international coalition that was defeating Nazi Germany. As the French 2nd Armoured Division approached Paris, it passed through the suburbs, where civilians came out to cheer and welcome the liberators. People who had lived under occupation for 4 years could barely believe that freedom was finally at hand. They threw flowers at the tanks, offered food and wine to the soldiers, and wept with joy. For the soldiers of the 2nd Armoured Division, many of whom were seeing their homeland for the first time in years, it was an emotional moment. They were coming home, and they were bringing freedom with them. On the evening of August 24th and into the early hours of August 25th, the first elements of the French 2nd Armoured Division entered Paris. The lead units were greeted with jubilation by Parisians who had been fighting for days and were running low on ammunition and supplies. Church bells rang throughout the city, announcing the arrival of the liberators. The sound of those bells, silent for 4 years of occupation, was a powerful symbol of freedom returning to Paris. Fighting continued in some areas, but the presence of Allied tanks and troops tipped the balance decisively against the Germans. Not all German forces surrendered immediately. Several strong points, including the Luxembourg Palace, the Senate building, and various military installations, had to be taken by force. German snipers continued to fire from rooftops and windows. Some German units fought with determination, while others, recognizing the futility of further resistance, began to surrender. The fighting on August 25th was intense in certain areas, with tank battles in the streets and close-quarters combat in buildings. By afternoon, however, most German resistance was collapsing. At 2:30 p.m. on August 25, 1944, General von Choltitz signed the surrender document at the Hotel Meurice, which had served as German headquarters. He surrendered to General Leclerc and Henri Roltanguy, the communist leader of the FFI in Paris. The surrender document formally ended German military control of Paris. Von Choltitz's decision not to destroy Paris before surrendering has been the subject of much debate. He later claimed in his memoirs that he disobeyed Hitler's orders because he could not bring himself to destroy such a beautiful and historic city. The truth is likely more complex. He recognized that the war was lost, that destruction would be pointless, and that he might face war crimes charges if he carried out such orders. As news of the surrender spread, Paris erupted in celebration. People poured into the streets singing, dancing, and embracing. The nightmare of occupation was over. Tears of joy mixed with tears of grief for those who had not lived to see this day. French flags appeared everywhere, hanging from windows, waved by crowds, draped over vehicles. The tricolour, banned by the Germans for 4 years, now flew proudly throughout the city. Parisians celebrated not just the arrival of Allied soldiers, but their own courage in rising up against their oppressors. The liberation of Paris was a moment of collective joy and relief that few who experienced it would ever forget. The resistance fighters who had started the uprising and the soldiers of the 2nd Armoured Division celebrated together. Men who had been fighting in the shadows for years could now stand openly in uniform. Some resistance members joined the regular army units. Others returned to their civilian lives, their wartime mission complete. There was a sense of brotherhood between those who had fought inside Paris and those who had fought to reach it. They had all contributed to the liberation, and they all shared in the victory. On August 26, 1944, General Charles de Gaulle made his triumphal entry into Paris. He walked down the Champs-Élysées from the Arc de Triomphe to Notre Dame Cathedral in one of the most iconic moments of World War II. Hundreds of thousands of Parisians lined the route, cheering wildly. De Gaulle, tall and imperious, walked with confidence and dignity, embodying the resurgence of France. He was flanked by resistance leaders, French generals and Allied officers, but he was clearly the central figure. This was his moment, the culmination of 4 years of exile and struggle. The celebration at Notre Dame Cathedral was interrupted by gunfire. Shots rang out, possibly from German snipers or collaborators, creating panic among the crowd. De Gaulle remained remarkably calm, refusing to take cover, while others around him ducked. The incident demonstrated that while Paris had been liberated, it was not yet entirely secure. Nevertheless, the ceremony continued, and de Gaulle's courage under fire enhanced his reputation. The Te Deum was sung in the great cathedral, giving thanks for the liberation of Paris. In the days following the liberation, Paris began the process of returning to normal life. The French flag was raised over the Eiffel Tower, replacing the swastika that had flown there for 4 years. Collaborators were arrested and faced justice, some through proper legal channels, others through extrajudicial retribution. Women who had relationships with German soldiers had their heads shaved in public humiliation. While these acts of revenge were understandable given the suffering under occupation, they also represented a dark side of the liberation. De Gaulle moved quickly to establish his provisional government and restore order, asserting French sovereignty and beginning the process of national reconstruction. The liberation of Paris on August 25, 1944, was more than just a military victory. It was a moment of tremendous symbolic importance. Paris was not just another city, it was the heart of France, one of the great cultural capitals of the world. Its liberation demonstrated that Nazi Germany's grip on Europe was breaking. The fact that French forces played a leading role in liberating their own capital was crucial for French national pride and for the legitimacy of de Gaulle's government. The liberation came at a cost. Approximately 3,000 people died during the week of fighting in Paris: resistance fighters, German soldiers, French civilians, and Allied troops. Many buildings were damaged, though Paris was spared the wholesale destruction that befell other European cities. The preservation of Paris was due to a combination of factors: von Choltitz's refusal to carry out destruction orders, the speed of the liberation, and the courage of those who fought to free the city before the Germans could demolish it. For the French people, the liberation of Paris was a moment of redemption after the humiliation of 1940. France had suffered a devastating defeat and endured 4 years of occupation, collaboration, and shame. The liberation, with French soldiers and resistance fighters playing central roles, allowed France to claim a place among the victorious Allied nations. It was not simply a matter of being rescued by foreign armies. The French had liberated themselves with Allied support. The liberation of Paris also had important political consequences. De Gaulle moved swiftly to establish his provisional government, preventing a potential power vacuum that might have been filled by communist resistance groups or by Allied military administration. He asserted French sovereignty and ensured that France would have a voice in shaping the post-war world. His government would face many challenges in the months and years ahead: collaborators to prosecute, a country to rebuild, a place in the post-war order to secure. But the liberation of Paris gave him the legitimacy and momentum he needed. For the Allies, the liberation of Paris provided a tremendous morale boost. The images of jubilant Parisians greeting their liberators, of French flags flying once again over the city's monuments, of General de Gaulle walking triumphantly down the Champs-Élysées, These were powerful symbols that the war was being won. They helped maintain support for the war effort among Allied populations and demonstrated to the world that the Nazis could be defeated. However, the war was far from over. While Paris celebrated, fighting continued throughout France and across Europe. Allied forces still had to break through the German border's defences, cross the Rhine, and fight their way into Germany itself. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 would show that German forces were still capable of launching major counter-offensives. The war in Europe would not end until May 1945, and the Pacific War would continue until August 1945. For the people of Paris, liberation brought joy but also hardship. The city's infrastructure had been damaged. Food and fuel remained scarce for years after the liberation. The process of bringing collaborators to justice was often rushed and sometimes unjust. Families mourned those who had been deported to concentration camps and would never return. The liberation marked the end of one ordeal, but the beginning of another difficult period of recovery and reconstruction. The French resistance, which had played such a crucial role in the uprising and in preparing the way for liberation, faced an uncertain future. Some resistance members joined the regular French army and continued fighting until the end of the war. Others returned to civilian life, their contributions sometimes recognized, sometimes forgotten. Communist resistance members found themselves at odds with de Gaulle's government, leading to political tensions that would persist for years. The memory of resistance and collaboration would shape French politics and society for decades. The liberation of Paris has been commemorated in countless books, films, and memorials. The courage of the resistance fighters, the bravery of the soldiers who fought to free the city, and the joy of the liberated population have become part of the collective memory of World War II. August 25th is celebrated in France as Liberation Day, a reminder of the moment when Paris threw off the Nazi yoke and reclaimed its freedom. Today, when we walk through the streets of Paris, we walk on ground where ordinary people fought for their freedom. The barricades are gone, the bullet holes have been repaired, and the scars of war have healed. But the memory remains of that week in August 1944, when Paris rose up, when Allied armies came to its aid, and when freedom returned to one of the world's greatest cities. The liberation of Paris teaches us several important lessons. It shows us the importance of resistance against tyranny, even when the odds seem impossible. It demonstrates the power of symbols and morale in warfare. It reminds us that liberation comes at a cost, paid by those brave enough to fight for it. And it shows us that freedom, once lost, can be regained through courage, sacrifice, and determination. The story of Paris's liberation is ultimately a story about human resilience and the unquenchable desire for freedom. For 4 long years, Parisians endured occupation, privation, and persecution. They watched as their city was used by their enemies, as their neighbours were arrested and deported, as their culture and way of life were suppressed. But they never stopped hoping, never stopped resisting, never stopped believing that one day they would be free again. When that day finally came in August 1944, it was the result of many factors. The courage of resistance fighters who risked everything to fight back, the determination of de Gaulle and the Free French to liberate their homeland, the strategic decisions of Allied commanders, the willingness of von Choltitz to spare Paris from destruction, and most of all, the spirit of ordinary Parisians who refused to accept defeat. The liberation of Paris was not the end of World War II, but it was a turning point. It demonstrated that Nazi Germany could be beaten, that occupied peoples could liberate themselves, and that the tide of history was turning against tyranny. The images of that liberation, French tanks rolling through the streets, resistance fighters embracing soldiers, the tricolour flying once again over the Eiffel Tower, de Gaulle walking down the Champs-Élysées, remain some of the most powerful and inspiring images of the entire war. As we remember the liberation of Paris, we honour all those who fought for it, the resistance members who lived and fought in the shadows, the soldiers who crossed oceans and continents to free Europe, the civilians who endured occupation and kept hope alive, and all those who did not live to see Liberation Day, but whose sacrifice made it possible. The liberation of Paris reminds us that freedom is precious, that it must be defended, and that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, are capable of extraordinary courage. It is a story that deserves to be remembered and told to new generations, so that the sacrifices made in August 1944 are never forgotten, and so that we never take our freedom for granted. Paris today stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a city that survived occupation and emerged free. The liberation of Paris in August 1944 was not just the freeing of a city, it was the reaffirmation of the values of liberty, equality, and fraternity that France holds dear. It was a moment when ordinary people became heroes, when a city refused to die, and when freedom triumphed over tyranny. This is the story of the liberation of Paris, a story of darkness and light, of suffering and joy, of occupation and freedom. It is a story that reminds us of the best and worst of humanity, and it is a story that 80 years later still has the power to inspire and move us. The liberation of Paris was how France was freed in 1944, but more than that, it was how the French people freed themselves, reclaiming their city, their dignity, and their future.